I wrote out a statement that I haven't yet posted that says something like, well, I don't know what it says, but my thought was, if you look at how people go through galleries and museums, they rarely stop walking. I mean, they're looking at a glance, and they're not looking at all. Of course, some look very slowly, but they look very slowly because they're photographing everything without looking at it, one work at a time. And so what I wrote was suggesting that this kind of viewing you'll completely miss what I'm getting at with this kind of viewing. That for one of the works that represents a month, you've got about 30 images, in some cases exactly 30. You have to look at all of them, each image and its detail. You have to look at how they combine left to right, top to bottom, and how a single image connects with an images 2 or 3 away as well. In some cases, there are connections across the whole month. And so what I'm aware of in thinking about the viewer is that the viewer of my work who can actually appreciate it is going to be extremely rare. And that's something that is important for me to know so that I don't get disappointed when I never get shows and nobody ever buys anything. Lately, I haven't been trying, but cinema was my main medium for a long time. And of course, what cinema does is combine multiple images, which is also what I'm doing. The origins of this work go back to the late 70s and early 80s, when I had various grand filmmaking ideas, none of which I could realize. The grandest I couldn't realize for practical financial reasons. There were more modest ones that I just never, for whatever reason, got around to trying to realize. And I started to think about still photos and about the idea of combining still photos. And I had this idea that probably would have been a failure, of a little folding book of black and white photos of Chicago buildings from 2 different angles, the side and the front, or one side and the other side. And my idea there was that this would create a feeling of space akin to what happens in the cinema, in good cinema, which is I don't get any feeling of space from Star Wars. But the cinema that I love, the camera moves this way, it cuts to that, and if it's coherent, a particular kind of space emerges. And that made me think maybe I could work with still photography. And in fact, when I started working in 2005, the first thing that I finished that I thought might be great, which was called Adjacencies 1, is 22 sheets of houses in Iowa, shot exactly that way, 2 or 3 different angles, but always including, in other words, not from the front and the back, always rotating around them, so to speak. My old friend Tom Gunning, who I was able to show some very early work to, looked at it and said, I don't know what medium this is in. He seemed to like it. I wasn't clear. But he was interested, and he said, I don't know what medium this is in. It's not photography. It's not cinema. I wanted to say, well, I've invented something original. It's certainly not photography. The 2 mediums you mentioned are 2 of 5 that I would list as what I would like to think of as influences. So you mentioned cinema and literature. And I would add painting, music, and architecture. The painting aspect is a sort of joke that I told about my early work. which is that I'm trying to get the exact same effect as Van Eyck, this sense of hyper intense reality whose intensity has an almost spiritual dimension. But that not being as good an artist as Van Eyck, I need many images to try to get at what he could achieve in one. Architecture should be obvious because it has a spatial quality that is certainly what I'm trying to get at. In fact, the other origin of all this work came when I bought my first digital camera in 2002 and started shooting for what became this work. My original idea, because it was in advance of a trip to Europe, was to show, almost prove, that you could not convey the feeling of architecture in one image, or even two. And so the idea would be to show buildings from many, many perspectives. And I have some examples of that I'm proud of. Accretion 6, which anyone could find online by searching, which has the title Niemeyer Niederroy, is of an Oscar Niemeyer building, a museum, from many different angles, outside and inside, and close and far, and so on. And I've been doing some aspect of that ever since. Painting might be the hardest to justify, although I just explained why. I do think of the whole design. So it's actually classical music that's the hardest to justify. All I can say is that I get a lot of my ideas about form from classical music, almost entirely Bach and much earlier. I shoot very quickly, and I would myself attack that. I heard of an art instructor or photo instructor at the School of the Art Institute I think this was his first assignment for the first day of his photo class. Go to some location, look at it for 2 hours, then take a photo. On the one hand, that sounded great. It's exactly what we need to do. Slow down, observe the world, let an artwork emerge out of that. And I'm at the other extreme. I arrive and I start shooting. And my only defense, really, is that very often I'll shoot a second and third composition thinking, did I really think this through the first time? And the great majority of time I wind up using the first one. There's a line that's probably from some Eastern practice, first thought, best thought, that I always thought was really stupid. But it seems to be working out for me that that's the case. And I think part of it is that to make a good image, at least for me, is to not be overly self-conscious. And, at the point that when I look at a scene and something falls into place, it has often a perfection that gets soiled and overdone when I reframe it a little to get it more, quote, perfect, unquote. But my sense is that we have gone from direct experience of things. You look out on the savannah, you find animals to chase, you examine the valleys and find edible plants. I don't know how people lived. And I object to the idea of looking at landscape and finding it in only things to eat or to mine by digging holes.
Point to the one you made. Could you do that again? Just like that. Great. Thanks.
Her name is Jamie.
Gemini?
Jamie.
Gemini.
Jamie. Jamie. I-E.
Oh, Ginny. Oh, it's a strange figure. The eyes made me think it was a skeleton, but it's not. It's a real figure.
Those look like eyebrows.
Eggshell?
Eyebrows.
Sorry?
Eyebrows.
Eyebrows.
But all their experiences were direct, looking at actual things. And they experienced landscape as a continuity
Only one car.
rather than broken. And our culture has reduced everything to objects and images. So it's the view through the car windshield, which is profoundly alienated from everything that we see. When I first learned to drive, I was already bicycling everywhere. And I was absolutely horrified by the feeling that I got when I first depressed the accelerator slightly, at how little effort was involved, at how disconnected from my body the experience of driving is. Everything about our culture alienates us from the world and from its parts, the parts of the culture, and from each other. And so it's a dream of lost wholeness, not the acquisition of it. And so I'll put two images together with a line that continues from one to the next. Two totally unrelated images. One could be of a lake and the other could be of the side of a ruined building. And sometimes those lines actually just happen to meet, but other times I'll crop one of the images to get them to meet exactly. And it looks artificial and absurd, but that's because it's a dream. There isn't wholeness there. Everything is connected, but the way we see it is broken. And so I'm trying to somehow enact an attempt to restore some feeling of that. And this is not something I would say of my other work, although it's in there in a less explicit way.
This is from a while ago. His name is Seppi, and he has awkward eyes. I don't know why I would have put them to the side.
So he's a figure in the video game.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do with him? Did you change him at all?
I was back there.
I did change it. I turned him into a human. He's this weird balloon thing. I just remember that. I use watercolor because in Cuphead everything is made out of watercolor. Except the characters. Everything is drawn watercolor.
Well, when you say you use watercolor, are you talking about the iPad?
Yeah, there's a brush.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
And so that's also why there's the calendrical scheme, where the months are laid out like the calendar of the days of a month, to point out the arbitrariness of our time measuring systems, but then also, once we understand the arbitrariness, we can see the connections that are made according to these arbitrary schemes as well. And so it's a response to what I think is what sometimes feels like the apocalyptic ending of our civilization that comes from all the brokennesses we have created in order to create the fabulous wealth and technology that makes it even possible. That is the only thing that makes it possible for me to actually make this work. Outdoors, I'm usually looking through an attachment that fits over the LCD screen and isolates everything except for what's on the screen. And that's both helpful and a little disturbing because I'm concentrating only on the image. Then, I'm not as observant as I would like to think one should be. That is, plumbing each aspect of the image that I'm proposing to shoot. Because of the nature of this project, my mind is partly off in some kind of abstractions of putting together, the idea of putting together many different kinds of things. And it's hard even to describe what it is, but I'm partly removed from the kind of close looking that I hope the final works encourage and that I very much believe in. I'm a little bit floating in the clouds, so to speak. And that's a kind of crucial aspect of what I'm doing in a way. And I would defend it by saying that simply taking images that record meticulous details in a beautiful way is not enough for me. I'm thinking about trying to make connections between different parts of the world. And on a particular day, I'm usually only filming one part, because each day is dedicated to a single subject or two related subjects. The nature of this project, I knew almost from the beginning, is going to be that by certain aesthetic standards that I would recognize, it's going to be imperfect. I don't think that means it's less good aesthetically, although it could mean that. But my idea is that there are going to be all kinds of roughnesses in which it's not clear that everything is smoothly blending together. In a piece of music by Bach, there may be weaknesses that a musicologist who's also a brilliant understander of Bach can discern. I can't discern any. The works are completely perfect, at least almost all of them. But since what I'm trying to do is create a sense of connections across many parts of the world, even if those parts of the world are within a couple of city blocks, I'm certainly not capable of doing that in a way that produces grids that are perfectly well organized. And there are always going to be beautiful moments of smooth connection, beautiful moments of connections that aren't too smooth, and connections that maybe seem not too profound. And as I said, somebody else might regard that as an aesthetic weakness, and I could debate that. I've seen perfect works, quote unquote, that were totally boring and not very good. Perfect, in other words, on their own narrow terms. I'm going for something more, something huge, a sense of a person trying to assemble the pieces of the world into an ecstatically great and coherent and intellectually coherent whole.